So this is our Ruyer reading group. We're reading the book Neofinalism, and we are picking up from the beginning of chapter 2. So that is page 8 of the translation. We read the introduction and, no, not the introduction. That was the translator's introduction. We read chapter 1, which is a short chapter. And so the first chapter is, Ruyer's title for it is The Axiological Cogito. So he presents essentially an argument for why this sort of axiological domain, or the domain of sense or value, whatever term you want to use, is in effect impossible to deny, in the same way that Descartes, of course, in the cogito argument, he says you can doubt the existence of physical objects, you can doubt mathematical truths, etc., but you can't doubt your own existence, just by virtue of having the thought that of doubt, you are sort of demonstrating to yourself that you exist. And so the argument here for Ruyer is similar, in the sense that he wants to show that expressing a doubt about, or denying that there is such a thing as a domain of sense or a domain of value, there are sort of various equivalent forms. Just expressing that rejection of that domain sort of presupposes that domain itself. It's not possible to express that proposition without sort of negating what it is you're expressing. So the sort of form of this argument is what he calls a double dilemma, and he's sort of borrowing this from two 19th, early 20th century French philosophers who are pretty much forgotten now. Gilles Lequier and Renouvier, I forget his first name. Having to do with the way they express the argument is in terms of freedom. So it's a question whether a human being is subject to deterministic laws of the universe or something along those lines. So freedom is an illusion, or freedom doesn't exist, or human beings are free. And then so the dilemma is, so there's a certain whether the proposition that human beings are free is true or false. So that's one sort of pair of options. And then in each of those cases, I as a human being can either affirm determinism or affirm freedom. So there's four possibilities. The four possibilities are, I am actually determined and I affirm that I'm determined, or I am actually free and I affirm that I'm determined. And the third, I am determined and I affirm that I'm free. Or the fourth one is I am free and I affirm that I'm free. And so essentially the first and third. So if I, the two cases where I am actually determined, in those two cases, my statement is not really a statement. It's just a sort of effect of the mechanism of my body. So those ones are sort of excluded just by the fact that this determinism applies to me. And then the second one, if I'm actually free but I affirm that I'm determined, then I'm saying something false about myself. So that means the only possibility is the last one, that I am free and affirm my freedom. So essentially the statement that I am free is only really a statement if I am in fact free. Just by virtue of expressing that statement, I sort of demonstrate to myself that I am free, in the same way that the cogito in Descartes means that just by expressing a doubt, I demonstrate to myself that I exist. But then he goes through some I guess more subtleties related to this argument, because you can set up an argument that looks quite similar to prove that you are in fact infallible, which obviously if you can prove your own infallibility with some sort of argument pattern, then that suggests that the argument pattern is probably not a very good one. But he shows why the application of this argument to the infallibility case is not the same as the application to the determinism versus freedom case. And then he gives like a more I guess, narrow characterization of when this type of argument is applicable. And so it's whenever there's this sort of domain of sense, yeah, it's a sort of domain of sense or value. Yeah, these are sort of like equivalent domains, and freedom, of course, is also a domain of sense because an assertion that I am free is an assertion that I can sort of that my actions have a sense and are not just the result of some sort of mechanism or process that is going on, regardless of what sort of sense I might attribute to those actions. Yeah, so this domain of sense is one of his kind of, I guess, fundamental concepts that appears throughout his work. But yeah, so we're going to go through much more discussion of what exactly that means in the rest of this book. Okay, so let's pick up from the beginning of chapter 2. If someone would like to read the first couple pages.
I can read. Chapter 2, Description of Finalist Activity. The striking parallelism between the different possible contents that can be given to the quote-unquote cogito, or to the most complicated form used by Renouvier, proves their equivalence. In any case, it proves that existence, freedom, signifying or finalist activity, evaluation, and work, according to a norm, are intimately connected. Common sense and language implicitly recognize these intimate bonds. Well, what do you want to do, unquote, is synonymous with, quote, what is the sense of your acts, unquote, and implies at the same time that we are addressing a real being to whom we say, quote unquote, you, and not a machine made of bits and scraps. That is, that we are addressing a free being who has a will and makes an effort. The question also indicates that we will judge the value of the activity of the one we are addressing, and that he will be responsible for this value. The intimate connection between these various notions forbids their separation and analysis. It also allows us to clarify the true sense of some of them. Not every freedom, existence, or act can serve as the content of an enlarged quote-unquote cogito. These three notions may be taken in a false or overly broad sense, which would render them useless. A. Freedom. If the word freedom is taken in the sense of quote-unquote freedom of indifference, or quote-unquote pure spontaneity, if it is taken in the Bergsonian sense, which would imply total unpredictability in both cases, we cannot, as we have already stressed, prove this kind of quote-unquote freedom by the Lequier-Renouvier argument. The freedom at issue here is the freedom to accomplish a task that may be judged successful or not. It is not indeterminate in the purely negative sense of the term. It is the freedom to quote-unquote succeed, to give a sense to my action, instead of the freedom to determinism, which interests me in the problem of if I dread making a mistake, if I feel its cruel possibility, I am free. And it matters little whether my action is predictable. Quote, suppose that I have hit on a piece of mathematical research which promises interesting results. The assurance that I most desire is that the result which I write down at the end shall be the work of a mind which respects truth and logic, not the work of a hand which respects Maxwell's equations and the conservation of it. In this case, I am by no means anxious to stress the fact, if it is a fact, that the operations of the mind are unpredictable. Indeed, I often prefer to use a multiplying machine whose results are less unpredictable than those of my own mental arithmetic. But the truth of the result, 7 times 11 equals 77, lies in its character as a possible mental operation, and not in the fact that it is turned out automatically by a special combination of cogwheels. The case of calculators, in which the norm of calculation becomes an assemblage of material organs, provides an invaluable guiding thread for understanding the very nature of free and finalist activity. This activity essentially consists in improvising and establishing cerebral or physical connections that allow the incarnation of the good sought after results in physical order. The example of calculators also helps us understand the connections between the order of signifying and the order of determinism and step-by-step causality. Here the machine borrows its sense from the man who built it in view of a specific end. Just like the results it yields, this machine be considered good or bad. It is the organ of a free center of activity. I guess my first impression of this section is I assume that Ruyer is going to argue for a kind of finalism in all kinds of his true forms. So like electrons and molecules, embryos, and it's not immediately clear to me how kind of action in accordance with a rule can be used to describe the behavior of some inorganic entity, for instance. I understand also the difference between two senses of freedom, and he's trying to call real freedom and the inauthentic. And he's obviously right that there's a difference between freedom in the sense that he wants to say is true freedom and freedom of indifference. So like someone who doesn't know how to play a card game is free to play badly, but that wouldn't be sort of freedom in a stronger sense of knowing the rules and playing the game well. But I guess to me that shows that there's a distinction between these two kinds of freedom, but not that only one of them is freedom in a meaningful sense. Kind of, I guess, in this chapter in general, a lot of Ruyer's examples are from the example of like the mathematical equation, for instance. It's pretty clearly delineated, and it's obvious whether someone has gotten it right or wrong. But I think there are a lot of activities that are not as teleological in a clean-cut way, and that in particular, even if we can kind of identify norms for particular activities, whether or not there are like meta norms that apply to all activities is less clear and might be kind of a complicator for his argument here.
Yeah, I mean, the example of calculating 7 by 11 is a particularly simple example because there's only one determinate answer, and there's a sense, I guess, in which the answer already sort of it pre-exists your attempt to solve the problem. Like this is a kind of, I don't know, maybe grade 5 student or something would be given this problem to solve, and obviously this is not you're not assigning this problem to the grade 5 student because it's a sort of new piece of information that you want to add to like the stock of human knowledge. It's sort of an exercise in evaluating whether the student has sort of grasped the technique of multiplication properly. Then of course there's many other tasks or actions that we perform where it's a lot harder to say that the outcome was sort of predetermined before the action was actually taken. So I don't know, writing a novel, for example. I mean, you do sometimes have writers who say something like the book was already sort of there and I just had to discover it or something like that. But I think like most people who engage in that sort of more open-ended like creative activity have a very distinct sense of having to sort of find their way, and how a lot of it is like a sort of iterative process of writing a draft which is not very good and then making it a bit better, etc. And so they have like a very strong sense that they're creating something that didn't already exist, or finding a way to make that task possible. I think though it's still, I mean, it's probably more complicated than it's definitely more complicated than the example of the multiplication problem. But I think at the same time, if you're writing a novel, you can still evaluate the outcome and say whether it was successful or not. And of course, there will be a lot more room for interpretation in terms of different evaluations of that outcome. Obviously, some people will say this is a great novel. Other people will say that doesn't do anything for me. And the author themselves might have a different evaluation of whether the novel succeeded in the task that they had set themselves in writing that novel. They might end up writing a very different novel than what they had set out to write. But it's still something that is not arbitrary in the sense that you can't you can just put any word after another if you want, or even sort of constrained by grammatical rules to make coherent sentences, but that doesn't sort of necessarily result in even a comprehensible novel, much less a good novel. So yeah, the action of writing a novel that is at least coherent enough to understand, and ideally something that people would evaluate as good, already implies a certain amount of selection and sort of control over the process that is not arbitrary, even if the novel that results from the whole writing process is not kind of predetermined. So it's obviously it's much less determined than the multiplication problem, where there's one correct answer that before the student even sat down to figure out this problem already sort of existed in some sense. But at the same time, it's not just a sort of arbitrary anything goes. I mean, you can write a novel about anything, but once you decide which novel you're going to write, that there's good and bad ways of having of performing that task. So I think it's a more sort of complicated and subtle sort of evaluation process, but it's still a non-arbitrary form of freedom.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm trying to think of other examples. I think Ruyer later on talks about like surrealists and automatic writing, but I think he would put that in terms of kind of a framed activity or intentional action that has this kind of detour and through a kind of non-intentional phase, and then becomes intentional again, at the point where either the artist is trying to publish it or, maybe kind of curating or cleaning up the results. So, yeah, it is difficult to think of activities that would fall outside of that so that they couldn't, I guess, seem to be normative in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much everything that a person, I mean, yeah, so in like philosophy of action, in sort of analytic philosophy, there's sort of like this basic distinction between sort of behavior or just things that happen in a person's body. So like sneezing is not an action in general. You just sort of have this physiological response to dust in the air or whatever. Whereas say turning on the light in a room it is an action. Um, Although of course there could be some situation. Let's say you're an actor where you are sort of in some way you sort of bring about sneezing as a kind of performance. So that in this case it would be an action. And then there could be some situation where turning on the light switch is actually just some involuntary spasm of your arm that happens to strike the light switch and turn it on. And so yeah, there's obviously these sort of somewhat absurd situations where one could what looks like an action turns out not to be an action, or vice versa. But in general, it's a sort of distinction between these sort of physiological events that happen in a human body on the one hand, and then actions in the proper sense on the other hand. And in general, it has to do with this success criterion. So like sneezing is not something you can sort of do correctly or incorrectly. It's just something that happens in the same way that a rock falling down a hill doesn't happen correctly or incorrectly, it just happens. Whereas an action in the proper sense is something that can be successful or unsuccessful. You could try to flick the light switch and I don't know, miss the switch. I don't know, maybe it's in the dark or whatever. You can't see the switch and you press in the wrong place or something. So the fact that some action is evaluated as successful, or maybe to put it another way, is that it has to something can't be an action unless it's subject to evaluation as successful or unsuccessful. And so in this sense, most of what we do, even the trivial things like flicking a light switch, are actions. But of course, many of those actions are sort of habitual actions in the way that, like, this example of the calculation problem. If you're someone who has learned your times table, you don't sort of have to sit down and like discover this result again each time you want to figure out what the the product of 7 and 11 is you just sort of have this like pre-built pattern that you can like sort of let it, you can just sort of trigger that pattern to run whatever you need to find that product. And the same way like many, like we have sort of conversational patterns that we use, hi, how are you, whatever, something like that, in that we can sort of use in certain situations. But then we also have the capacity to have a more, I guess, creative conversation where we're asking questions and expressing opinions and telling stories, etc. That requires more, I guess, new creation to happen, and you can do that either well or badly. In the same way that you can write a novel well or badly. And I think this point about the calculation problem is a pretty important one. That, I mean, we're going to come back to this, I think, throughout the book, but it came up in the previous one we read as well. This sort of idea that that you can sort of set up machines in yourself as a free person, and then likewise in any other situation where there's this element of freedom or responsiveness to the realm of sense. It's not the case that being a free being requires you to sort of create yourself anew at every instant in this maybe sort of like existentialist freedom sense. Most of what we do on any given day is sort of to a large extent running through these sort of habitual patterns that have already been like pre-built. So like you don't have to decide every morning, am I going to have a coffee this morning? It's just something you do every morning. Am I going to brush my teeth? How am I going to brush my teeth, etc. Like all of this is stuff that you have sort of acquired this habit to do. And so the case of the calculation, you can use like he's talking here about these sort of adding machines that existed at this time. This sort of mechanical device that has gears and wheels and so on that mechanically produces a certain result if you press certain buttons. But then if you do the multiplication in your head, you're sort of relying on the fact that you have like built a sort of adding machine in your head by just by sort of rote repetition in school, where you just sort of learned these patterns and sort of drilled them into yourself or had them drilled into you. And so there isn't really any difference in principle between the performing this multiplication in your head versus entering certain numbers into the machine and reading the outcome. But it's still this sort of framing process is there in the sense that you as a free being can decide which numbers you want to multiply, for example. So the adding machine doesn't add any numbers on its own. It just sits there if no one uses it. It's only when a person for one reason or another enters some numbers that the wheels turn, and then a different number is displayed at the end. And then of course from the machine's perspective, if you want to sort of use that term, it doesn't like whether that number that comes out at the end is correct or not is indifferent. If the wheels are sort of misaligned, and it produces the wrong result, that the machine has no sort of it doesn't care what the result is. It doesn't care about anything because it's just a bunch of gears. So whether the machine produces the correct result or not, it has to do with the purposes for which a human is using that machine, and has no sort of impact on the machine's functioning itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
What I wrote in the chat, maybe we can just, something I just want to keep in mind as we're reading is like when it comes to a given like the psychophysical sets that he talked about in the cybernetics book. Once these machines have been set up, then there's a kind of, we can find a principle of evaluation, and they can be more or less automatically executed. But then for a living being, or at least for a complex living being, there seems to be this ability to decide to kind of set up a machine. For instance, like if you decide you want to learn guitar or learn how to paint or whatever, and it's not clear to me that, I mean, once you're playing guitar, there are kind of criteria for evaluation, but for the sort of decision to engage in the activity in the first place, that also has a sense and is less obviously directed by. It's hard to say that there's can kind of do well or do badly in choosing between becoming a guitarist or becoming a painter, I guess.
Yeah, I think this gets to like sort of a question of like ethics in a very broad sense. Like, so not necessarily, maybe you could distinguish between sort of morality in the sense of like, wrong and right and wrong, but then ethics in a sort of broader sense of evaluation of action in the sort of most general sense. Because yeah, so you as a person can decide to decide you want to learn to play guitar or decide you want to learn to paint. There's many different ways you could, decide to live your life. And we obviously only have a finite amount of time to, engage in each of these life projects. And so, yeah, you can't do all of these projects. You have to make a selection between them. And yeah, it's quite difficult to say that, choosing to, become a guitarist is better or worse than choosing to become a painter. There is like even like already in Aristotle, there's like questions about whether when you can say that someone has sort of lived a successful life, that their life has been good, and yeah, that's quite a difficult question. I do think there is some sense that there are cases where someone says I've wasted my life, or I went down the wrong path or something like that. There's for Aristotle, you can only say that someone has lived a good life after they're dead. But then I think he also talks about like the question of like if their children, like I don't know, end up being captured and taken as slaves after they've died, can we say that has made their life not good, sort of retroactively? I can't remember what his sort of response to that is, but yeah, so even if there's no very sort of determinate way of evaluating, what one does with one's life, I guess, in the broadest sense, there's still maybe more sort of locally, ways of evaluating that, people sometimes do have a sense that they have wasted their life, or maybe, on their deathbed they say, I did really achieve what I wanted to achieve with my life, or lived it the way I wanted to live it. So and of course, someone could be wrong about that as well. They might think that they've wasted their life, but then, in a maybe more like in another sense, maybe that life wasn't wasted. And it's hard to say exactly how you would determine that. But I think, yeah, just because, I mean, the fact that this decision is very difficult to make in general, I think doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some sense in which one can live better or worse, like sort of in general, even when these decisions don't have a clear criterion for how we would decide in a particular case. But yeah, so like this has to do with something like virtue in the Aristotelian sense of like sort of fulfilling the what it is to be a human being. And of course there isn't just sort of one way of doing that, of being excellent as a human being. But yeah, it doesn't mean that any sort of life path is as good as any other. There are obviously some very bad life paths that are not excellent, and then probably a lot of sort of mediocre ones that are a mix of excellent and not so excellent. Okay, so maybe we can go on to the next bit. Someone else could read from B, existence.
Yeah, I can do this. B, existence. Similarly, quote unquote, existence, on which the Cartesian, quote unquote, cogito depends, is not any existence whatever, but uniquely the existence of a center signifying acts. In parentheses, defined according to what W. Stern terms the, quote, subjective axiological a priori, end quote. Substance existence, whether the substance is described as quote unquote mental, quote unquote spiritual, or otherwise, eludes the probative force of the axiological quote-unquote cogito. A mind manifests itself only through its cognitive activity, that is, its signifying and evaluating activity. And outside this activity, the mind's hypothetical existence as a pure substance is no more within our purview than, quote, pure spontaneity, unquote. A, quote, free substance, unquote, or a, quote, senseful substance, unquote. Such expressions are probably just as absurd as the expression, quote, intelligent square, unquote. Last, the absolute existence of the existentialists who affirm that existence precedes sense just as freedom precedes the value, senses, and ends its quote-unquote grounds, also falls outside the purview of the quote-unquote cogito, or of the Renouvier reasoning. I'll move on to C. C, work activity. By the same token, the activity we have in mind should be taken in its proper sense of a work activity. It is different from a pure functioning here, the French fonctionnement, as far as it requires the invention of means. It is the accomplishment of a task that can be considered successful or not, according to a criterion and to norms independent of the agent's whim. Looking for the quotient of a division of the premises of a syllogism, whose conclusion we are given, trying to find the best arrangement of furniture in a room, trying to assemble the organs of a machine. Each of these represents an authentic activity and an authentic effort, because successes cannot be described arbitrarily. A truly, quote-unquote, gratuitous act is not an act at all. In reality, like, quote, absolute existence, unquote, or, quote, pure freedom, unquote, the, quote, gratuitous act, unquote, of novelists is always obliquely monitored by the author, in parentheses, or, or by the interposed character, for an aesthetic effect of its political sense, and it becomes meaningful to the extent that this effect is sought. A poet or painter does not need to be a surrealist to understand the advantage of exploiting dreams or psychological accidents. But because the painter or the poet seeks an aesthetic effect in this accident, he becomes active once again merely by the decision he took to remain passive before his dream in order to convey the impression of a dream. It is the same for the decorator who makes use of a kaleidoscope, or the photographer who selects the frame and the layout of his shot. Our age's typical claim of dispensing with norms and values, independent of the will, is more ostensible than real. Humans are so much forced to be free as to be endowed with sense. They are free only inasmuch as they are endowed and act sensefully. Sense and end attached to all my acts, better than glue to the hand that tries to get rid of it. An anti-finalist wants to prove that he is right, just as a supporter of the, quote, philosophy of the absurd, unquote, is convinced that he espoused the only reasonable attitude. On the other hand, there is a danger in restricting this sense of work to, quote, industrial or agricultural work, unquote. Modern philosophy often commits the error for which Greek philosophers are justifiably reproached, for they deem the slave's labor to be socially inferior and were thus led to overestimate pure speculation. Contemporary humans are immersed in a particular technical and economic civilization. They perpetually wield economic tools. Philosophy is tempted to either curse instrumentality, C.F. Bergson, Scheller, Heidegger, Jaspers, Gabriel Marcel, etc., or conversely to restrict the signification of quote-unquote work to industrial work. Metaphysically, the notion of work activity is quite fundamental. Work activity is tied to existence and freedom. Every definition of existence and of freedom is hollow if it does not implicitly postulate this relation. Freedom equals existence equals work. To eliminate one of these three terms is to discard the other. A being is an authentic being, that is, a free being, only to the extent that it makes an effort. By definition, every actual existent actualizes, that is, works. A being that ceases to work, that no longer accomplishes any act, that lets itself drift, is quite obviously no longer free. Quote unquote, free is an attribute that cannot apply directly to substance being. It applies only to an act or to an acting being. Free substance is a contradiction in terms. Free act is a pleonasm. Work activity, freedom, and proper existence are inseparable from three other notions, and they bring these equally inseparable notions to light. Should I move on here? It's kind of continuous, huh?
I think we can stop here.
Okay.
So so maybe just to go through the two points that we went through here, the existence and work activity. So existence, so here he's sort of pointing to the fact that in the cogito, like in Descartes' version, when he talks about, of course, the famous result is that I exist, but this existence is a sort of intrinsically senseful existence, in the sense that when I find that I exist, it's as a thinking being. So I exist insofar as I think, and whether that thinking is sort of grounded in some other, like, more fundamental reality or not, is sort of external to the cogito itself. So I can show that I exist as a thinking being, but whether that thinking being is, say, like a physical body or some other I don't know, metaphysical entity of some kind, that is something that can't be demonstrated by means of the cogito. Like in Descartes himself, he will argue that my capacity to clearly and distinctly perceive that I am a thinking being sort of implies that thinking is the thinking being is a distinct substance from extended bodies. And then, of course, he has a hard time explaining how this thinking being is related to the portion of extension that is normally designated as its body. But that's a whole sort of separate development and requires him to bring in the beneficent God who would not make me in such a way that I would make errors about what I clearly and distinctly perceive, and so on. So it's a whole sort of separate argument, and it doesn't come from the cogito itself. And then the second one, the work activity. So he's pointing to the fact that as we were discussing earlier, that when we talk about an action or activity, as he says here, this is something that can be evaluated as successful or unsuccessful. And then he sort of talks about the sort of surrealist, sort of search for something that would sort of be produced independently of one's will. So these sort of like automatic writing type techniques, and setting up a machine to drip paint on a paintboard, on a canvas or something. These types of processes that various artists in different domains tried to set up so that they would kind of produce an artwork independently of something like a human decision. But as Ruyer points out here, that of course the decision to build a machine that drips paint onto the canvas, and then to exhibit that canvas in a gallery and so on, all these things are still human decisions that sort of frame the process of the machine dripping paint on the canvas. And ultimately this is not really that different from the, I guess, traditional painting process, where you pick up a paintbrush and apply the paint on the canvas using that brush with your hand. In the same way, like your hand movements are sort of machines in a different sense. They're sort of biological machines, and you're not sort of having to create the muscle contractions freely anew each time you pick up a paintbrush, for example. And part of your sort of education as a painter is precisely to master the technique of applying paint in a certain way on a canvas, so that you are no longer sort of thinking about and sort of creating that technique each time you do it. You just sort of automatically hold the brush in such a way and apply this amount of pressure and so on to produce this effect. So yeah, your training as a painter in this sort of more traditional painting style is precisely building these biological machines within yourself that allow you to produce these effects on the canvas. And so it's in principle not really any different from building a mechanical device that drips paint on the canvas. You could in theory, I guess, build a mechanical device that would produce a painting that looks exactly like I don't know, a Rubens painting or something like that. Just like it holds the paintbrush and dips it in the paint and applies it to the canvas and so on, and it's just everything looks exactly like as if it were painted by Rubens, but it's all produced by the machine, and so it's not in principle any different in terms of the physical actions that are, or physical movements that are being performed. The difference has to do with where the sense of this painting comes from. Whether it's a person or if it's produced by some, I don't know, computer program or whatever. It actually reminds me, is slightly off, slightly tangent here, but there's this guy who shortly after Midjourney was first released, who produced a painting produced an artwork or an image, I guess, using Midjourney, and submitted it to some like state art fair or something like that, and was actually awarded the prize. But that was before, I guess, the committee had known that he was using AI to produce this image. And there was like all kinds of controversy about this. And then he has tried to copyright his image, and has failed multiple times in different court settings, because they're saying inserting a prompt into an AI tool to produce an image is not sort of equivalent to drawing it yourself or painting it or whatever. But yeah, so he's argued that his process of producing that painting or producing that image. So he says he went through, I think, like 600 different variations on the prompt to get it exactly how he wanted it, and then did some like retouching afterwards, etc. So he says it's still a creative process in the same way that it would have been if he had drawn it. But yeah, courts haven't been convinced so far. But I think for Ruyer, he would say that this is in some sense the same thing if you sort of conceive an image and bring it about using some AI tool versus conceiving the image and producing it on canvas with your hands. It's like in principle the same kind of process, even if one takes the detour of this complicated digital machine, and the other one involves an even more complicated biological machine.
I think Ruyer would distinguish though between the sort of the unconscious detour in the case of both the AI art and the surrealist or related unconscious writing, or I mean automatic writing, or whatever kind of random effect generator the artist has recourse to. And I think it seems to me that for Ruyer, like painting would be an enveloped action, kind of with a sense the whole way, sort of through the action. And it wouldn't be, I mean, I think he would definitely hold that it is, you need to establish these sort of biological machines, in terms of like facility with grasping the brush and moving it in the right kind of way. But I think there's a difference in terms of Ruyer's ontology, I guess, between like active improvisation, for instance, and automatic writing, or just kind of giving the creative execution itself to AI.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that no one, like no courts or anyone has really been convinced by this guy's arguments about how he is really the sort of creative force behind this image, does suggest that there's a sort of obscure perception of a difference in principle between drawing something yourself versus telling an AI tool how to produce, or what image you want it to produce. But I think maybe I don't know exactly how Ruyer would evaluate that case. I mean, we saw in the cybernetics book that he's generally not that impressed by sort of claims about tools, mechanical, electronic, whatever devices that are supposed to be sort of reproducing human performances. I guess it's partly a matter of sort of degree. To what extent does the human who has this conception for an image, to what extent are they sort of controlling the process, I guess? In the case of like Midjourney, like you basically are just like inputting a sentence and, you don't really have any control over the process by means of which that tool is producing the image. So there's a bit more, I guess, control when it's an iterative process, like, he says he used where, so he didn't just sort of give one sentence and then take the output, but he sort of kept giving different versions of the prompt until he got whatever he was, satisfied with. But it's still like, I mean, you can do that without having any understanding of, how this tool works, for example. You just sort of give it a bunch of sentences and go through it until you get one that you like. But you don't need to know anything about the underlying architecture of the system. So I think it's partly this sort of lack of control that makes us hesitate to describe, producing a Midjourney image as like an act of creation. But yeah, I think there's probably a good chance that might change as these tools become more and more prevalent. It might, we might, 20 whatever years from now, we might be more willing to, describe producing an image using an AI tool as creative, or maybe there'll be like a complete rejection of it, Butlerian jihad or something, and we'll destroy all the AI tools. But yeah, I think these, like, I would imagine there were probably, similar discussions going on when photography emerged as well, that, is taking a photo creative, and obviously it's creative in a different sense, or it's not creative in the same sense as painting is, but I think most of us would today recognize that you can be creative as a photographer, in the way that you're, selecting the sort of framing of the shot and evaluating the lighting and all these things. But yeah, so what it means to be creative as a photographer is something that had to be sort of developed in a way that was not necessary, what wasn't exactly the same or even that similar to what it is to be creative as a painter. And maybe, what it is to be creative as a AI prompt person is something that is still sort of not clear and will take time to develop. I also want to take the opportunity when we're talking about these like sort of gratuitous acts and chants and so on to mention this that I put in the chat here, the quote from Lautréamont, this famous quote where he describes this boy as handsome as the chance juxtaposition of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table, which was sort of like taken as an inspiration by surrealists. That book is, the fact that book was written in the 19th century is kind of like mind blowing. Anyway, that was just sort of an aside. But this is sort of an example of like this, I guess, attempt to produce something arbitrary in the sense that part of what the sort of like force of this quote is like the fact that this pairing of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissection table is sort of like absurd and meaningless, or doesn't, like, there's no obvious reason why these things would all be together. But of course, the act of selecting this arbitrary sounding collection of objects is itself an act that has sense. Like you can perform the action of selecting an arbitrary collection of objects in a good or bad way. You can like successfully produce that effect or not. So like this sort of like attempt to escape the realm of sense and to produce this sort of arbitrary collection of objects is itself something that is like sort of trapped within the realm of sense. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I'm gonna like reread that last sort of sentence that sort of leads into the next bit, just for coherence sake here. Work activity, freedom, and proper existence are inseparable from three other notions, and they bring these equally inseparable notions to light. D. Finality. A work activity is defined by an end because an activity is, by definition, not a simple succession of causes and effects driving one another. It has a sense that is not merely vectorial. Here I should probably mention, this has come up before here, that the French word sens can mean sense or meaning, but it can also mean direction in the sense of, driving in a certain direction. So yeah, in this passage, he's sort of like playing on the fact that it has these multiple meanings. A senseless, i.e. directionless trajectory is poorly oriented toward an end, a trajectory that leads to nothing. Sense and end are nearly interchangeable words, but the terms end and finality are linguistically more specialized. Moreover, Whitehead's argument, quote, "It is absurd to have as one's end the proof that there is no finality," end quote, does not appear as decisive as the one from which we started. Quote, "It is absurd to claim and to signify that nothing has a sense," unquote, even though the two arguments are naturally equivalent. In everyday language, the end of an action designates its goal more often than its sense, while the sense of an action envelops the totality of this action, just as the sense of a pronounced sentence envelops or quote-unquote surveys, survoler, the word's temporal succession. Its end designates a final state that takes place in space and time, like the phases of the action that tend toward it. Finality in this narrow sense can easily shock the philosophical mind, because it appears to imply a logically contradictory causality of the future. If, to remedy this contradiction, we admit that the material future end is present in the form of an actual idea, we no longer risk a logical contradiction, but rather the reduction of finality to pure causality, in the form of a, quote, causality of the idea, unquote, of an idea that is conceived not as a general, non-localizable theme of action, but as a simple ring in a causal succession. Last by a more advanced specialization, at least in everyday language, finality almost always acquires a utilitarian aspect. When we speak of the goal of an action, the word goal evokes the idea of a material economic value more often than an aesthetic, moral, religious, juridical, or pedagogic value or ideal. To travel for pleasure often seems synonymous with, quote, to travel aimlessly, unquote. Some measure of this ordinary sense always risks slipping into the philosophical use of the term. The Bergsonian critique of finality was influenced by the utilitarian aspect of the concept. When, instead of the actual finality of an ongoing activity, we consider the quote-unquote fossil finality of an industrial machine, a mechanism, or an organic assemblage, there's an even greater temptation to pose the question of finality in the form, quote, what purpose does it serve, unquote. And when, in the case of the living organism as a whole, we can no longer ask, quote, what purpose does it serve, unquote, as in the case of the heart or the spleen that conserves the entire organism, we have the impression that we are exiting the domain of finality, even though we are merely exiting the domain of utilitarian finality. The notion of, quote, finality without end, unquote, is the byproduct of this error. It is an error that rectifies another error and not a profound philosophical discovery. The notion of, quote, finality without end, unquote, seems very subtle, but in fact it smacks of, quote unquote, Philistinism, for it presumes that quote unquote true finality is utilitarian. An organism strives to conserve itself, but more profoundly strives to exist, that is, to actualize values in general, and not simply to struggle secondarily with the aid of subordinated and useful mechanisms against intoxication, asphyxiation, or desiccation. So this bit is, I think, a bit subtle. He wants to sort of remove a certain misconception about the notion of finality, a sort of confusion between finality in the sense that he wants to use it and the end of an action in maybe the more everyday sense. And so he points out that when we ask for the purpose of something, if you say, if you ask someone, why did you do that action? What was the purpose of that action? And they say, because I enjoyed it or something like that, you would generally not treat that as a sort of satisfactory answer. Doing something for the sake of it, as we sometimes say, that is almost like a denial that there's a purpose to the action. Like doing something for its own sake. Like there's there was the like early 20th century art for art's sake sort of movement, and that was sort of taken as a rejection of using art for pedagogical purposes or to instill moral values or any of these other sort of I guess, external purposes for art. So when you sort of give the purpose or describe the purpose of an action as enjoyment or pleasure or for its own sake or something like that, you are in a sense rejecting, or you're taken to be denying that the action has a purpose. Whereas for Ruyer to act for the sake of pleasure is still a kind of finality. Um, and yeah, so this is finality, even if it's not a purpose in the sort of normal meaning of that term. Or you can perform an action sort of for its own sake, but that performance can be a good or a bad performance, even if that good or bad is not sort of explicable in terms of like a more sort of everyday kind of end or purpose. You can perform an action, sort of for its own sake or like intrinsically, and then sort of not get it right, or do it like poorly, even if that action doesn't affect your bank account or advance your career, or these more sort of like everyday kind of motives that we recognize as purposes. Yeah, electrons are not all about that grind. um, and then the bit about living beings, I think, is especially interesting because, of course, when you look at you know when you look at a living being, like an animal, for example, has skin that, say, prevents the fluids in the organism's body from being evaporated, or has various other protective functions. So you can say that the purpose of the skin is to retain water in the organism. And obviously that's a oversimplification because skin has many different functions at the same time. But then if you ask, okay, well, what's the purpose of like the organism as a whole? I don't know, a deer or a frog or whatever doesn't have a purpose in the sense of there's no sort of goal that this organism is like striving to achieve. It just sort of is itself a sort of finality. It is so it's not the case that a frog is like trying to achieve a certain goal and trying to bring about a certain purpose. It's just that the frog itself is a finality that is being sort of exercised in the world. So the frog's skin has a function, but the frog itself does not have a function. Except if you sort of you can sort of incorporate the frog into a broader system, like an ecological relationship, and say that the frog serves to regulate the population of insects, for example. But of course, the frog itself doesn't care about whether that whether the population of insects is regulated or not. And yeah, that's a good question. Whether this is connected with that normativity question about living one's life in the sort of broad sense. Yeah, can a frog be better at being a frog or worse? I guess you'd have to ask the frogs about that. I'm not sure. um, but yeah, so this sort of finality is a kind of intrinsic finality, in the sense that it's not like an attempt to achieve something. It's just a sort of self exercise of that finality. But yeah, it's we'll see more. As we go through this book, we'll get I think a better understanding of what that means.
Yeah, that's a very interesting idea. I'm not totally sure what he means by that. But yeah, I just wanted to say that this, the end of that first paragraph was clarifying for me, when he said that the sense of an action envelops the totality of the action, just as the sense of a pronounced sentence envelops or surveys the word's temporal succession. That helps me picture what exactly he means by an action having a sense. So, like, when I express, the sense of some sentence I'm saying right now, there's a sense in which that meaning or sense is kind of spread out across the entirety of the pronunciation. So even though the sounds of the pronunciation, obviously, no one of them would be sufficient to convey the sense all of them together do because the sense is kind of surveying them the way Ruyer is talking about. But it's easier for me to picture an action as having a sense in the same way. So like you would have, the kind of real components of the action, and then the sense of the action kind of remaining stable, if not the same, throughout its execution.
Yeah, so maybe a good way of understanding this would be to sort of contrast it with the way that LLMs work. So that they involve like sort of predicting based on like so the sort of technical term is next token prediction. So like you have a collection of words, and then you sort of predict, given this word, what is the chance that the next word will be X. And of course, it uses not just one word, but a sequence. It sort of builds a sentence by taking the first n words have been these ones, and then so the next word should be this one. And this, of course, is completely different than the way that a person constructs a sentence. We don't sort of just take one word and then predict what the next word is going to be, and then build a sentence like that. We have some sort of sense that we're expressing, and that sense in a very mysterious and complicated way is sort of turned into a sequence of sounds or of marks on a page or whatever, and then the person who hears or reads that sentence is capable of grasping something like the sense from hearing or reading the sentence, and so the LLM is just sort of like moving from one token to the next, or one set of tokens, 5 words or whatever, and then generating the next one from that. So it's in this sense, it's a kind of chain of causes or chain of sort of elements in this mechanical process, or electronic process in this case, but mechanical in the sort of broader sense. And this is something I think we talked about in the cybernetics reading, is that like the ChatGPT doesn't have any way of sort of like evaluating the things that it produces and say, does this make sense? Is this a good answer or a bad answer? It just sort of produces the answer that is statistically likely to sort of correspond to the input. And this is how you get things like, I think it was the Google, the Gemini that like told people to use glue to like keep the cheese on the pizza or something like that. So yeah, you get these like absurd answers that, anyone who is like familiar with the way the world works and like the purpose of human actions and so on would never, give this kind of answer. But the machine is just sort of like, it's sort of maybe the word like sticking or like sticking something to another, like it just sort of like statistically finds that this word is associated with glue, and then it just sort of produces this outcome that it doesn't make any sense. So the way that a person produces a sentence or reads a sentence involves some sort of grasp of the sense of that sentence, rather than just sort of connecting one word to the next and sort of bringing about a sentence just by like statistical correlations. And this is like again to like connected with what we were talking about in the Merleau-Ponty book, where he talks about this like melodic grasp of an action, where grasping a melody is not just a matter of sort of hearing one note and then hearing the next note. It's a question of sort of grasping a whole pattern of the melody. And so it involves this kind of what Ruyer calls this absolute survey, the sort of like stepping out of the specific note that is happening now, or the one that just happened, and sort of grasping them as a temporal pattern. And so this is the same way that when you grasp a sentence, you're not just finding that this word has a statistical correlation with the word that follows it. You are sort of grasping a connection that is goes beyond that sort of one word being statistically correlated with the next one. And this also this, in sort of like more general cases, like any action that we perform, of course, as I was talking about earlier, most of the things we do over the course of a day are sort of habits or things that we do all the time, and so it wouldn't be difficult to predict what we were going to do next. If you like always brush your teeth after breakfast every morning, then if someone observes you finishing breakfast and predicts you're going to brush your teeth, that's probably a pretty safe prediction. But the way that we sort of generate those actions is not just a matter of producing the next action, or maybe to put it another way, that they're even these sort of very predictable, sort of routinized actions are sort of the result, or they're sort of like, as he calls it in the case of machines here, like the fossilized result of sort of decisions, or I guess this more sort of survey capacity. So you can decide maybe that brushing your teeth, maybe you decide I'm going to break free of the tyranny of brushing one's teeth. I'm going to live without brushing my teeth ever again. Probably not a very wise decision, but you could decide to do that and change your habits. So yeah, any of these actions, even though they're sort of routinized and habitual and may in some sense have this sort of mechanical quality of just having one cause lead to the next, they're always sort of subject to the possibility of changing the decision that they are sort of fossilizations of. You can decide to do something different, or maybe you discover like some miraculous technique that replaces brushing your teeth that is much better. I don't know what that would be anyway, but like yeah, you can make some creative decision that does something different, rather than just brushing your teeth in the same way you always do.
I just want to note quickly that there's kind of a cool resonance with Husserl and the idea of like the sense remaining either stable or identical across the series of real acts. For Husserl, obviously the sense and the sense and its relation to the transcendent object similarly remain stable across a series of the real or real perspectival adumbrations of the object in a way that's similar to the surveying action, I guess, Ruyer is talking about here.
Yeah, and that's definitely not a coincidence, because he of course maybe the most famous of his texts is the time consciousness one, and which talks about the melody, perceiving a melody. But yeah, so that like when you, for example, when you see a table, so you at any given moment there's like you're sort of seeing the table by means of seeing a certain perspective on the table. You're only ever seeing the table from a certain angle. It could be above or below or whatever. But there's you are grasping the same table as you walk around it, or pick it up or whatever, do all these different things to see different sides of it. You're always only seeing one side of it, but you, by means of seeing one side of it, you are seeing the table as such, and the same table, as you move around it and manipulate it in all these different ways. And so this is like precisely what it means to see an object as like something that exists in the physical world, is the grasp of that object as the same as it, as our perspective on it changes. Okay, yeah, so we can go on to the next bit from E, invention.
I can read again unless anyone who hasn't read. Jack, do you have your mic? If not, it's fine.
Yeah, I can read. Every work activity presupposes an effort of invention, first in the determination of the thematic end into a more particular, albeit always thematic, goal, then in the discovery of the means for attaining this goal and successfully carrying out the work. A work in the proper sense, that is, an axiological work, implicates a creation of form. It can never become a pure functioning without degrading. It is not a set of movements according to the ready-made links of a machine, or according to the differences in potential of a field of forces. In the domain of physics, work activity corresponds not to work, force displacing in point of application, but rather to action. energy multiplied by time. The action of classical physics was found to be a statistical phenomenon, setting in play a great number of elementary actions, each of which probably has the character of work activity. In quantum physics, action is a creation of form and not a functioning. In the domain of classical physics, this character is masked by statistical effects.
Oh, sorry. You can go on to the next bit as well.
Last value, F. Because a genuine work can be deemed successful or unsuccessful, it is obviously implies the notion of value and correlatively of the norm or rule that has to be followed, either to achieve success and validity or to judge the value of the work. There are many orders of work as there are orders of value. There is theoretical, artistic, moral, judicial, political, social, pedagogic work. As a consequence of this, there are many species of the axiological cogito. I strive to know. I strive to achieve an artistic expression. I strive to teach. I strive to enrich myself. Therefore, I am. To this description of sense, and of the six notions that are at one with the idea of sense, we should add a crucial corollary. Every senseful, free, valid, inventive activity is by definition opposed to the notion of a pure functioning, a pure succession of numerable causes and effects coming one after another in a well-defined spatio-temporal order without any possible reversibility, a succession that is by definition incapable of surveying itself. From this point of view, the four-dimensional world of classical relativist physics, with its universal lines, where past and future events are in their places, represents nothing more than an infinitely flat schema. In other words, congenitally incapable of containing real, that is, active existence. If we believe that the ordinary physical world is consistent with the scheme of classical relativist physics, then we have to admit that the description of senseful activity forces us to posit an other world, in another dimension, in the non-rigorous sense of this term, because it is obviously not a matter of a fifth dimension fixed to space-time. The ideal world of values and essences, to which the consciousness at work is addressed, both to aim for ends and to discover means. By definition, ends and means do not exist as such in the world of causes and effects, or at least they cannot be encountered in numbered places along a universe line. The sense of an activity is what this activity is not, in its literal unfolding. The sense of a voyage is the end of the voyage, in the double sense of the word end. So a dualist conception of two worlds, real world and ideal world, is necessary for understanding sense, finality, work, invention, and conscious existence. If the schema of classical physics is taken to the letter, it is clear that activity proper requires the positing of an ideal domain that is irreducible to the plane where causes and effects exceed one another. In this ideal domain, conscious intention can move and survey without strict spatio-temporal localization and by exploring possibilities. The plane of causes and effects so as to influence the unfolding of means toward the ideal end. This duality of two worlds is not the last word on the question, but if we want to correctly describe and situate senseful activity, then the compensatory hypothesis of an ideal world is the inevitable counterpart of the fiction of a world of universe lines or of pure causal lines. Ooh, we got a cool figure coming up.
Yeah, maybe we can stop here and yeah, save the figure for the next one. No, it is nice. I like the drawing style, which unfortunately is not going to be conveyed over the recording. But yeah, so the this bit about this dualism is also a very important element of Ruyer's like thought in general, which we saw in the cybernetics book. This idea that there's this non-spatial dimension that we have to sort of use to grasp this realm of sense that is not sort of spatially related to the 3 dimensions of space and then the 1 dimension of time that we sort of understand in physics. As he points out here, this is not going to be the last word on the question. We're going to get more complicated accounts of this later. But if you sort of take a classical physics picture of the world in which everything is just entities that are bringing about effects in each other, through various causal forms, fields that interact and so on, then if you sort of take that as your picture of the physical world, then you need this other sort of non-physical realm of sense to understand something like an action as something that can be done well or poorly, because of course, and in a sort of physical process, the sun going supernova or whatever, that process is not done poorly or well. It just is something that happens as a result of various processes that are sort of make up that broader process. And so this sort of normative evaluation of something as being good or bad, or well performed or badly performed, implies this kind of dimension of sense that is not to be found within the spatiotemporal realm in which those processes are being performed. So yeah, I think this sort of more complicated picture that he's going to present has to do with the way that our famous electrons and so on are themselves sort of performing a kind of action in the sense of realizing a value. So this is his sort of like panpsychist moment. But yeah, it's if we sort of start from the presupposition of classical physics, then we have to sort of attach this non-spatial temporal dimension to that world to be able to evaluate actions as good or bad, or well or poorly performed.
The space of reasons.
Yeah, we need a glowing eyes Brandom emoji reaction or something.
It's nice after the last book where Ruyer was often focused on more, I guess, local issues in cybernetics to get such a full statement of his metaphysics. I guess we got the impression in the cybernetics book that he was a kind of dualist, in that he always talks about this transspatial, transtemporal world of sense. He seems to be embracing that characterization, I guess, here. I'm kind of seeing Ruyer now as I think that he, even though he is often critical of existentialism and phenomenology and certainly doesn't agree with all of their conclusions, I think he realizes that some of the points they make are valid, but instead of I guess as Husserl would, seeing everything as kind of within the realm of transcendental constitution by absolute subjectivity, he's kind of turning back to a more naturalist understanding of the world, and trying to sort of fit together the scientific picture and the phenomenological picture. Here, at least, they kind of fit together in this dualism, kind of as two halves of it, I guess. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it develops that.
Yeah, so I think the dualism is maybe going to be more of a sort of 2 aspects as opposed to 2 sort of realms, that in the sense that we'll sort of, I think, see how these 2 what seemed like 2 realms in the cybernetics book will be more, I guess, like intertwined with each other than they seemed in that book. So it'll be more, I guess, like 2 different sides of a system, rather than sort of 2 different sort of realms that are like divorced from each other. Okay, so I think we're about at time here. So yeah, maybe we can stop here and pick up from there with our cool diagram next week. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming out and for your contributions today. This book, I'm excited to see what we're going to get in the rest of this book.
Yeah, same here. It's been great so far. Yeah, thanks everyone, and see you next week.